Well, welcome to the Human Together podcast show. I'd like to welcome a very special guest from Israel, Dr. Avner Wishnitzer, to the show from Combatants for Peace. So I want to start out, first, thank you for agreeing to be on the show. Tell me about the organization Combatants for Peace.
So, first of all, thanks for the invitation. Combatants for Peace was formed in 2006 by people who had been involved in the armed struggle, in the conflict, in the violence between Israelis and Palestinians. The Israelis who founded this group were ex-soldiers or reserve soldiers, as I was. And from the Palestinian side, it was ex-militias who, most of them spent time in Israeli prisons for their activity against Israel. We came together already in 2005 in a series of let's say non-public meetings, and then after almost a year, we decided to go out in the open and publicly announce the launch of a new movement, which we named Combatants for Peace.
So
since that time, we've been active through several wars. We had to overcome significant challenges here in the region, and we still stand today together, trying to make a better future for this region, for both societies. Basically, we struggle together non-violently in a joint Israeli-Palestinian non-violent struggle against Israeli occupation and all other forms of violence. So this is like in 2 minutes.
You mentioned that you were in the military. What was your personal story that drove you to support a peaceful resolution?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a kibbutz, one of these socialist-like villages that dot Israel from south to north. And I grew up in a very kind of Zionist environment. And it was clear, just as for some Americans, college is there once you finish high school. Where I grew up, it was the army. Everybody went to the army, and preferably for combat units. It was part of the ethos. We were all bred since we were little. It was not an ultra-nationalist environment. It was not a right-wing environment. It was left of the center kind of mainstream environment. And like many of my peers, when we were in high school, we were already kind of preparing ourselves, mostly unconsciously, I think. I mean, the military was always there around us. We grew up on the stories of previous wars, and the children literature or books we read were all about, these heroes, war heroes. It was all around us. So I guess we weren't aware of the kind of indoctrination we were going through. And we had almost no contact whatsoever with Palestinians. So Palestinians were just a big mass of people that lived somewhere in the east and in the south, in the Gaza Strip. Very, very, very little contact. I don't think I've ever spoken to a Palestinian until after my military service, which is amazing, right? The distances here are so small, it's very hard for Americans to grasp how small this place is. So it would take me about an hour from where I grew up to, you know, some of the biggest Palestinian population centers. And yet I never traversed this distance. So it's a kind of segregated reality that since then it has become even more segregated. So I was left-leaning even as I was in high school, but everybody went to the army. I mean, it's just not, and I guess it was a very theoretical question for me, like the Palestinian issue. I was aware of that. My father, who served in the military as a reserve soldier in the first Intifada, even for years, and he was against the occupation, like actively against it, but still he thought, you know, if you get called, you have to go. So this was the kind of the ambivalence I grew up in, and when my time came, I tried to go for the best possible unit I could try and get into, which is Sayeret Matkal. It's an elite commando unit. The same one Netanyahu served in, the same one Ehud Barak served in. It's I guess I also, like many others, the prestige, I guess, was important. Anyway, so I passed all the tests and started my service and managed to finish the course of training and became a combatant soldier in that unit and remained there as a reserve soldier after I had completed my regular service. And it was during that time, after my return to civilian life, that I began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with mainstream narratives, and the second Intifada was raging, and the Israeli public was singing in a choir. The media was just rehearsing the governmental messages, and I felt there's something wrong about this. It must be more complicated than that. You know, Palestinians are bad, we are good, that's it, you know. And I started looking around. I was just starting my university. Different things happened during that time that got me to the West Bank as a civilian, as an activist for the first time in my life. I was 23 or 24, something like that. And what I saw there, I'd say, shook me. Not because I didn't know, but in a sense I didn't know, because there are different levels of knowing, right? When I saw with my own eyes what military rule means, dozens and dozens of years of you know, half a century of military rule, and what it does to civilian population, what it does to people my age, I was ashamed. I think many Americans, and I've spoken on different occasions, both in the US and with US citizens coming here on tours, and I think it's hard to grasp this systematic evil that is being normalized constantly. You know? you don't see all the little and not so little atrocities, and it's just daily. It's just, but it's brutal. And I think this is where my transformation began, from a kind of good mainstream Zionist boy to a Refusenik. In 2004, along with 12 other soldiers and officers in the same unit, we publicly announced our refusal to serve in the occupied territories. We declared that we would continue to serve in the Israeli army, but not as soldiers of the occupation. This was a big bang, because of the nature of the unit I served in. This made headlines in all major media outlets, and for several days it was the top story, and we were not prepared for this. We were just anonymous young individuals. But it wasn't pleasant, I can tell you that.
Imagine.
In a sense, it was harder than many of the things I had to do as a soldier. Definitely took more courage.
Yeah.
And once the dust started settling, I, like some of my friends, began to think about what's next. You can only refuse once, but we felt that if we refuse, and that's it, and the evil continues, then it's almost like washing our hands off this. It's not enough. So we try to find a way to continue the work against the occupation. I think at that time I was mostly motivated by shame, and it's important because it's exactly the kind of responsibility we felt as soldiers, but realizing that Israel is a more complex story that we've been told, and that feeling that we cannot stand behind many of the things that our country does. That feeling, we have to change. We can't just live with that. This is what drove us during those years, and but ultimately, about less than a year after we refused, we were approached through middlemen by a group of Palestinians who had heard about the Refusenik movement. We were not the first, our group was not the first to refuse publicly. And those Palestinians, who'd been mostly members of Tanzim Fatah, they wanted to meet. And so we went meeting them in Beit Jala, which is just south of Jerusalem. And this became the first meeting. It was completely spontaneous. There was nobody to tell us what to do, no coordinator or facilitator, nothing, just a group of men sitting on both sides of either side of a long table and trying to figure out what the hell are we doing here with people. Quite literally, we could have killed just 2, 3, 4 years earlier. There were about 10 or 12 from each side. It was very tense because both sides were very, very suspicious. This was still, the Intifada by then had already faded. But it was still, there was a lot of tension and a lot of violence going on. So, who are these people? Is it a trap? What do they really want? So, that was the beginning. We didn't come there to start a movement. We had no idea what's gonna happen. But I think what really struck us is that we share something. We share in the violence. And we began to see violence from the other side. So if you think about all of these Hollywood action movies, the 80s, say, the 90s, you always have this hero who becomes a hero by enacting violence on the other side, which is always faceless, just a mass of people. Think about John Rambo just machine gunning dozens of people and making himself a hero. It's the violence that makes him that. But if you think about all these poor people who had just been killed by him, think about this violence from the other side. This is what happened to us. Because I think in one way or another, we imagined ourselves as the protagonists of some big Hollywood production. Simplistic, sometimes very simplistic, very almost stupid narrative lines. Good guys, bad guys. And suddenly we realize that those people on the other side, they have their own story and it's completely different. But they also share this ability to kill us, not knowing us. Now there is no symmetry here, and that has to be clear. We were always the stronger party, by far. We occupied them. There is no symmetry in this conflict. But from a more from the point of view of the experience, of the individual experience, or the collective experience, this ability or this expectation that you engage in violence, this we shared. And it was, since we had no one to facilitate this and we had no agenda, we just started talking about ourselves, each of us. I am this and that from there or there. And I grew up in this village and I, joined Fatah, or if it was an Israeli, I went to the army because I believed in this and that. And this became this very, very simple narration of our own life in the face of the other, became our most important tool. Until today, we always tell our personal stories rather than lecture about, the conflict. The conflict is made of people like me and many others. And it is through this personal experience of growing up into it and being led to serve it as if we are figures in a play or a screenplay written for us. In Combatants for Peace, we decided we are not no longer actors on that stage when we refused. Next stage, we'll start writing our own script, our own play.
On narrative. Yeah.
A different story. What my friend Suleiman Khatib, Palestinian who served 10 years in Israeli prison, calls the third narrative. Not the Israeli narrative, not the Palestinian narrative, a third narrative. This is what we've been trying to do for nearly 17 years now.
Wow. It sounds like you've really humanized and put a face to that. And once you knew these people, knew their story, they were human, you're just like you.
Your voice came and went, so I'm not sure I got the...
Well, I was just making a comment about how you face to the other side, humanized that. So, and I think big on breaking down barriers. My next question, and you kind of hinted at this in remarks, is Israel has been criticized as being in an apartheid state. Would you agree with that analogy?
I guess that depends on your definition of apartheid. So let's leave the definition aside and let's just look at what there is in the West Bank. In the West Bank, there is a regime that holds different population under different legal systems. The Israeli settlers live under Israeli law, more or less, whereas the Palestinians live under military law. They have no influence over the political system that makes every decision or almost every decision about their lives. They don't decide on water, on movement, beyond the very small enclaves that, you know, that are left for Palestinian under the Palestinian Authority. And if I mentioned water, let me give you just one example. It's now the end of the summer here. This is a very dry area of the world, as you know, and the world is warming, in spite of what some people are saying. And there's very little water left in water reservoirs in the West Bank. And it's Israel that does the drilling for water and give them less. Very simple. So in many Palestinian villages, they get water for only a few hours a week. They fill tanks that they keep on the water so that they have water until the next week, until they get water again. Because Israel decides unilaterally how the water is being given. And of course, the Israeli settlements 1 or 2 kilometers away, no limitation on water whatsoever. I'm talking swimming pools, I'm talking everything. Imagine what it is for Palestinians to grow up in such a reality over which he or she has no control. It's not like they can vote somebody out of office. Nobody asks them. So saying that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East is just, I'm trying to be polite here, but I shouldn't really. It's just a load of crap. It's a democracy. It's a democracy for some people, and it's military rule for others. And it has been like that for more than half a century now. Now we can always play with words, but really you should just come and see what it looks like. All the words are falling short. It's just, you know.
It sounds like it fits the definition of what I would consider apartheid, one group ruling another, uh, and being real restrictive. I mean, your example of the water, uh, I've read about those things, but that just kind of really puts a personal story to that. So that really does kind of fit my definition of what I would consider apartheid state. Has the Combatants for Peace had official discussions with the Israeli government seeking change? Have you actually sat down at the table with Israeli government officials?
No, we are, our voice is usually muted by government officials. It's not like anybody's interested in hearing us. The biggest event we hold every year is the joint Israeli-Palestinian Memorial Service. And it's held around May every year. Growing every year. We started with maybe a few dozens of people 15 years ago, 16 years ago, in a fringe theater in Tel Aviv. The last event we could hold before the coronavirus struck, 9,000 people showed up, and it was broadcasted live around the world. Last May, it was an online event. We had more than 200,000 people worldwide tuning in. And the event basically is an act of rehumanizing, saying basically on both sides of the separation war, we are victims of this conflict, but we are also the perpetrators. We are also responsible for what's going on. And so we have to take responsibility. It's not enough to mourn the dead, which is what we do in this service, but we also call upon both societies to take responsibility and end it. Now, this was considered extremely subversive maybe 10, 12, 15 years ago. Now it's, I would say, moved closer to the mainstream, and it's covered by all major media in Israel. But the government, and this is why I'm telling you this now, the government of the last 5 years or so, when it became bigger, tried almost every year to stop it from happening. For example, by denying Palestinians permits to come to, because they need permits to go into Israel, what we call the Green Line, where the military rule ends and proper Israel begins. They need permits, and Israel, the government tried to deny those permits. We had to go to the Supreme Court and force the government to give these permits. So, and of course they attacked us on every possible, media for doing this, for being, traitors to our people, and so on and so forth. So the government is not, under Netanyahu for the last 11 years, is really not interested in hearing from us. So we are trying to work on the grassroots level to go on with educational programs and try to raise awareness and try to bring more Israeli in contact with Palestinians and their stories. And we do that regularly, even during these days of coronavirus, through online meetings and so on.
One of your grassroots effort is your Encounters program. Tell me a little bit about that.
So basically, we meet with, it used to be, before the corona, it used to be very regular. We meet, for example, with young Israelis who are about to go to the military, and we just tell them our stories, one Israeli, one Palestinian. So whereas the Israeli story if I was to tell my story to them, would have been vaguely familiar because they grew up in a completely different reality. A reality that in which nationalist indoctrination is much more intensive. It was always intensive, but it's over the last 10, 15 years, it's much, in my view, it's much worse. And ever since they remember themselves, Netanyahu is prime minister. And the rhetoric is very, very, it's all about force. Mm-hmm. There's no room for compassion. There's no room for, seeing the other as human being. There's no room for all that because they're just enemies. Again, this very simple story. And so even my story for them very often is kind of weird. What is this lefty doing here telling us is, they are even surprised. Last time I did it was about, 2 months ago. And, a group of maybe 20, 30 Israelis, 18-year-old, before the army. And one of them said to me before we started, he said, they said that maybe we are going to meet somebody who was in the army, and I told him, that's me, really. But they said you are a lefty. I said, yes, I was in the army. Yeah, really? Where did you serve? And when I told him, he just didn't believe me. This can't be. And just his friends tried to convince him that I wouldn't be, telling a lie. Mm-hmm. So if my story is weird to them, the Palestinian story, the Palestinian guy who tells the story, is for them science fiction. It's like coming from a different world. They don't get access to life on the other side of the wall. And suddenly they have somebody who tells them what it was to grow up under this condition, what it means for him to encounter Israeli soldiers in a checkpoint. Suddenly it's that view from the other side that sometimes is able to crack the wall or at least scratch it. So this is what we do in these encounters. Now it's mostly online.
Yeah, which is fair to speak. I've read about separation wall that one might encounter in a Bethlehem area tour. What purpose did these separation walls serve?
So the separation wall was built, the building began in the second Intifada, so the beginning of the 2000s. And it was against the background of suicide bombs in Israel. There was a lot of violence going on. Now there is a big discussion or argument about what purposes it served, but there's no question that while building it, Israel practically annexed huge stretches of land. So rather than building it over the 67 line, Israel moved it eastward, making it more difficult to defend because it became much longer. And in this way, annexing many, a lot of land. Officially, Palestinian farmers are allowed to go through special gates to work their land because not all of it has been taken. Some of this is private Palestinian soil. So they are allowed to officially, but very often it doesn't really work. So they just have to wait by these gates until some soldier opens it for them. And in many other places, the wall is not really a wall, it's a fence, and it's not even complete. So it doesn't even serve the defense purposes that was officially the reason for its building, because any Palestinian who wants to cross knows where it can be crossed.
Mhm.
Because some parts are just not built. They didn't complete it. So yeah, that's the separation wall in a few words.
So you spoke a lot about conflict and the differences in there. What is a common thread narrative that would unite both sides of the conflict? What message are you sending out as an organization in that front?
Right now, it's very hard to talk about such a message because, or I'll put it differently, we have our message, but it's very hard to get people to support it because over the last 15, 17 years, or maybe 20 years, I mean, since the beginning of the second Intifada, the Israeli public has shifted dramatically to the right. Adopting a narrative that I believe is false and was propagated first by former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, then by Ariel Sharon, and then by Netanyahu. There is no partner on the other side. It's not worth the effort. They're just not willing. The Palestinians, and as Israel is using this rhetoric, settlement expansion continues all the time. So again, I find my government not being genuine for years, because it constantly speaks about security, but settlement has nothing to do with it. We've started
Mm-hmm.
in the West Bank in the 70s, and we never stopped. And of course, settlement does not serve any security purpose. It just goes on and on and on. And settlement means confiscation of land, deportation of Palestinians. It doesn't just happen. So there's a lot of institutional violence that has been systematically taking place in order to start all these new settlements and then allow them to expand. So situation is becoming worse all the time. And from the Palestinian side, this is what they see. They see that just Israel is sending more and more and more people into this already crowded territory. And this contributes to the despair on the Palestinian side. You can add to this leadership on the Palestinian side that suffers from many different problems. The rivalry between Hamas and Fatah. So there are also intra-Palestinian problems, significant problems that prevent successful struggle. But everything together leads the Palestinian public to a kind of apathy. Like, people are just completely despaired. And now the coronavirus is just making things much worse, because economically it becomes hard to survive. So trying to promote our messages against this background has become very difficult. Our slogan is "There is another way." So if you want it in 4 words, 5 words, that's what it is. And we believe that if we had invested 1% of what we invest in violence, settlement expansion, and etc., in peace promoting processes, the results will be there in a relatively short period of time. So there is a way to reconciliation, and there are different political solutions. But at the moment, nobody is even beginning to consider these solutions. It's just, most Israelis, they just don't care.
Yeah.
They just don't care. There is security and stability in Israel. I mean, before the corona, now economically things are turning worse, but why should we care about those Palestinians, whom we don't trust anyway? So selling peace over the last years in Israel was next to impossible.
What you have a strong statement that there's another way. What elements of Combatant for Peace mission, there is another way, can other nations learn from? How can they see what you guys are doing, which is amazing? How can other nations learn from what you guys are doing in this unrest and conflict?
Well, first, I hesitate to advise. Nobody knows America better than the Americans. Nobody knows, Germany or England better than the Germans and the English. So I'm not here to teach our ways, but I do think that we have to learn from each other because the powers that are driving violence worldwide and dehumanize and spread racism, they are working jointly. Think about how Trump and Netanyahu lean on each other. And it's not just them, two persons, it's the movements that are behind them. It's the journalists that feed on each other's ideas. If they do that, and I can mention, others, like Bolsonaro in Brazil and Duterte in the Philippines and Orban in Hungary, and we can go on and on and on. We also need to do that. We also need to, carry the light of hope and humanity from one place to another, starting fires all the time. The good kind of fires, the kind that give us light and warmth. And I can say that the introduction to Combatants for Peace is in a really beautiful documentary that was released in 2015, and it's called Disturbing the Peace. It's available, it won several awards, Disturbing the Peace, and it's available, it was available on Netflix, maybe it's still available, I'm not sure, for several years. Amazon Prime, all these.
I'll try to put a link to that for my listeners and watchers, because I had read about that and I'm interested in watching that myself.
So there is also a website.
Okay.
The producer's website. So just type in Google Disturbing the Peace, and you can download it for a few dollars, very simple. And I really think it does an excellent job in just capturing the essence of Combatants for Peace. And this essence is, in one word, transformation.
Yeah.
So it's not just a movie that celebrates our work and so on and so. It tries to narrate transformation on an individual level, and then an organizational level, and then possibly spreading out from there. And I really recommend that movie, and it gives an idea of where we're coming from and what it is that we're trying to do. And I think also, and this is the producers and directors are Americans, and one of them, Steve Apkin, great guy, and I really learned a lot from him. he kept telling us, you have a story to tell, to tell the world. It's not just Israel, Palestine. You're kind of, you know, locked within your own reality, but this is relevant way beyond Israel and Palestine. And I have to admit, at first I didn't hear him, in a sense. I didn't really believe him, but only once the movies come out and we started touring literally the whole world with it, in festivals, in movie theaters, in the US, South America, and Europe, in South Africa, did we begin to realize that, yes, there is maybe not something to teach others, but at least share our experience and our experience with other people, because violence and hatred and racism are everywhere.
Yeah.
And it is everywhere that people need to see that there is another way. It just takes a lot of perseverance and determination to you know, to keep going and stand for these values that we hold so important.
So my last question is this, is how can people support Combatants for Peace, not only monetarily, but just, you know, in spirit, or how can they join the movement? Where can you direct people towards?
So we have wonderful organization, Friends organization, American Friends of Combatants for Peace. It's a registered NGO in the US. Just go to American Friends of Combatants for Peace, and it will lead you to different activities, webinars, different ways to join the effort, and exactly the kind of transatlantic, let's say, discussions about, and we are having a webinar, I think it's the 22nd of October, about vote suppression in the US and the political struggle against Netanyahu's government here, and what's going on in the West Bank. So we are talking about all these things together, trying to share experiences exactly in the spirit I was talking just a few minutes ago. So that's, I think, on the 22nd of October, but go to American Friends of Combatants for Peace, you will see the schedule and everything that's going on.
Well, I thank you for your time. This has been an education for me, and I know my listeners are looking forward to the positive message and all the great things that you and the whole organization, Combatants for Peace, are conducting, and you should definitely be commended for that. And I wish you well in the future, and you definitely have a supporter in me.
Thank you very much, and don't miss out on disturbing the peace.
Okay, thank you so much.